morning. We'd like to welcome you to this Facebook Live interview with Congressman Trey Gowdy. I think you were saying earlier this is your first Facebook Live experience.
I think so, but at my age I have recall problems, so I think it's my first one. It's the first one that I recall.
Well, we appreciate you coming in.
Yes, sir.
Let's get right into it. You recently announced that you're not going to seek re-election. Why is now the time to walk away? You're chairman of the Oversight Committee. Your friend Tim Scott says you had a meteoric rise. Why is now the time to come home?
I don't love it. You know, you've been in the journalism business longer than I've been in politics. You covered the very first race where I ran for district attorney, and I guess you were there when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I love the justice system. I love facts. I love fairness. I think process matters. Politics, at least at the national level, is about winning, and the end justifies the means. And you just have to decide whether or not, you know, I got, what, 2/3 of life in the rearview mirror and 1/3 of life in the windshield, and I just want to spend it in a system that I'm more comfortable in and in a system that I respect more, and that's the justice system.
And what exactly is your plan? That's pretty broad. I want to spend it in the justice system. Are we going to see Gowdy Law Firm or?
I don't know that I'm good enough at anything to launch my own. Of course, you know, I have a son finishing law school. I have a daughter who claims she's going. I have a chief of staff who's a really good lawyer, and some others. I'll practice in the upstate. It may be with an existing firm, and it may be in the civil justice system as opposed to the criminal justice system. There are really only three ways to prosecute. You can be the U.S. attorney, the attorney general, or the solicitor. We happen to have a really good solicitor in Spartanburg, which is where I'm going to live. So that job's taken. We have an attorney general. That job's taken, and I've already done the federal prosecution thing. So it'll be the civil justice system. But, you know, Bob, it could even be, you know, say this newspaper has an investigation, doesn't rise to the level of a criminal probe, but you want to know what happened. And you need to hire someone that is fact-centric and fair and has not already made up his or her mind. And you may hire a law firm to do that preliminary investigation. I went to Baylor, as you may recall. Significant issues with Title IX. Michigan State, significant issues with a physician that mistreated and abused the USA gymnastics team. All of those investigations are not criminal in nature, but the same skill set would apply.
Of course, you've been mentioned for this judgeship or that judgeship, and you said you're not interested. Is that a not interested now or a not interested forever?
Was interested forever. Was interested. It was always my dream job. You know, Donald Russell's courthouse is right around the block, and it's hard to grow up in Spartanburg and not be aware that Donald Russell was a governor, he was a United States senator, he was a federal judge, he was the president of the University of South Carolina. You know, arguably one of the more distinguished people who ever came from my hometown. That was always my dream job. Yeah, my wife knows me better than anyone else, and she knows what I'm not good at, which is a bigger category than the things I am good at. I think she prevailed upon me. That's a really isolated existence, an appellate court judge. And for every interesting case you get, a criminal case, constitutional issue, you may get 10 antitrust cases. You may get patent cases. And no offense to antitrust and patent law, it's not nearly as interesting as criminal law. So the isolation, I think she also convinced me that while I do like fairness, advocacy is a little bit different from just sitting there as a dispassionate judge. I watched an oral argument this morning, actually. John Few, who is one of the judges I have the most respect for, the humility to not insert yourself into a fact pattern is a really important discipline. And it can be learned, but you have to ask yourself, do you want to learn it? Do you enjoy being an advocate, or do you enjoy being kind of a neutral, detached umpire? And again, my wife has known me since I was 17 years old, and she helped me understand that I probably would not be a great appellate judge.
Let's talk about your time in Congress. And what do you feel like your legacy is going to be? What are your accomplishments that you'd like to plan?
I don't think I have a legacy. I think the legacy is however you may have impacted people's lives. And I think my Republican and Democrat colleagues would tell you he's fair. He's funnier than you think watching YouTube or watching interviews. That's really the only part of the day where I'm like that. I'd rather make you laugh than make you uncomfortable. I really actually, Bob, think the greatest legacy that the folks I work with in Spartanburg and Greenville office, the greatest legacy we'll leave is one that none of your readers and none of your viewers know anything about. It's constituent service. It's helping people that feel like they don't have a fighting chance against a big bureaucracy. And it's also something we started about 6 years ago, and the only rule I had was no media. And you don't know anything about it. But I'm not running again, so nobody can accuse me of doing this for political purposes. We have a program called I Am an Achiever, where I partner with teachers and guidance counselors throughout the district, and they identify children that have overcome significant obstacles in life, whether it is the death of a parent, the death of a sibling, an illness, and we go into their classroom and we recognize them. And we try to offer them a word of encouragement that how you conduct yourself, even in the face of adversity, gets noticed. And I would bet you, looking back 20 years, those young people that we have interacted with no media, no one knows anything about it. You won't see any pictures, you won't see any stories about it. But in terms of impacting people's lives, I hope those children remember that a middle-aged old man from Washington took notice of what they accomplished and recognized them in front of their classmates.
Do you think the public at large will look at Benghazi as your legacy?
Some. I think people outside of South Carolina will.
What did we learn from the investigation?
From the investigation, I think we learned a ton. We did not know who rescued our survivors from the annex until our investigation. We didn't learn about what we call a CIVETS, which is a secure video conference, where they made the decision to go to Tripoli and not Benghazi. I mean, if you think about all the questions surrounding Benghazi, why didn't we get there in time? We answered that question. Why'd you go to Tripoli and not Benghazi, which is where the firefight was? We answered that question. Who rescued our folks? Why was the security profile low? Those are the questions that I was interested in when I took the job. But in the throes of a presidential campaign, I would argue wildly disproportionate interest was in Secretary Clinton. Our report mentions her name less than the Democrat report does. She was a really important witness in a number of areas. She was one of 100 witnesses that we interviewed. Most people can't name 5 other witnesses we interviewed. I can, but they can't. The legacy of the Benghazi Committee, to me, is the report we wrote, and no one has taken exception to a single fact that we found. And as you may recall, I certainly do, the right wasn't happy because I wasn't tough enough on her. The left wasn't happy because they thought that it was all about her. And once a narrative gets imprinted in people's minds, it's really hard to defeat that narrative. So I can write a report that doesn't mention her. I think the Democrat report mentions Trump more than the Republican report mentions Clinton. And you'll have to refresh my recollection. I don't think President Trump had anything to do with Libya or Benghazi. So the narrative was written that it's about her. We did learn that she had a server, but of the 100 witness interviews we did, 2 were related to her email, 2%. So I can't control what others write, what others focus on. I'm at peace with what we did, and importantly, the family members of the 4 who lost their lives and the witnesses, the eyewitnesses who survived, I think, are appreciative of the effort.
You mentioned the reaction from both sides, the lock her up people who didn't think you went far enough, and the people who said it was a witch hunt. Do you think that the investigation not created, but contributed to the partisanship that we see today in Washington?
I think it existed a little bit before that. The first hearing we had, Dana Milbank complimented it, which may be a sign of the apocalypse. Pretty progressive Washington Post columnist. He complimented it. We Skyped in Tammy Duckworth, who's a friend that's now in the Senate because she could not be there. We Skyped in another Democrat. I did everything I could to try to have hearings that were apolitical, to show more grace towards the other side that would have been shown, I think, to us had the roles been reversed. But it was never going to be the kind of investigation that you may have wanted or I may have wanted. It just wasn't going to be that. And then when her email was discovered, everything changed. Everything changed. And look, the only reason the email was discovered is because if you're doing any investigation, you're going to want to read correspondence. Chris Stevens' emails we discovered. No other committee found those. Those, for some reason, were of much less interest to the public than hers. I mean, this is the ambassador, in one instance, the day before the attack, describing the situation in Libya and how he felt. That's really significant if you're investigating what happened and why. Very little attention to his emails, a lot of attention to hers. In a courtroom with 12 people that haven't made up their minds, you can kind of control the dynamic a little bit. Presidential race where almost everyone's made up their mind, it's tough.
With your background, coming from the justice system where facts do matter, facts are the only thing that matter, how do you function in the politicized atmosphere that we see today?
Not very well. There's a really small constituency for fairness. The most recent thing that's happened in Washington, the Rob Porter situation with very credible allegations of domestic violence. You try to take a fact-centric approach. Who knew what when? Who did you tell? Politics is about winning. And you're going to be criticized if you ask tough questions of your own side, and you're going to be given no credit by the other side for asking tough questions. It is unlike anything. We do not treat each other that way in everyday life. I am sure you have friends that have different political ideations. I know that I do, including some that I live with. They have different political ideations. We treat each other fairly. We either change the subject, we find something we agree on. We make it through life, even in spite of the contrast, not always running toward the conflict. Politics is totally different. You can agree on 90% and you're going to spend all of your time on the 10% upon which you do not agree. And so, do facts matter? I don't know. I never chanted lock her up. You will never, ever, ever see a tape of me at any rally saying that for a couple of reasons. Number one, legislators don't lock anybody up. And we do have something called due process. And it matters. It matters if you're innocent. It matters if you're guilty. In politics, you validate and ratify what the largest group already believes, and you're going to be successful.
Recently, there's been a lot of talk about dueling memos. You were, or at least according to reports, you were co-author of or a draft of the Nunes memo. Are you happy with the finished product? What does that memo prove, and what does it not prove?
I want to start at the beginning because I do think it's important. I don't think this part of it's ever been told before. At the time, I was the only Republican member who had gone over to the department and read everything. So not only do you have members that are on the House Intelligence Committee, which, by the way, is an incredibly hard committee to get on. The Speaker and the Speaker alone picks who's on that committee. It's highly coveted. So you've got Republican members there that entrusted just one person to go look at all of the underlying data. And I did not draft the memo. I edited the memo, and I could have added things to it, I suppose. I would have been allowed to do that. to me, that memo was a notice document. If you're a colleague on the House Intel Committee and I've read everything and you have not, at some point I got to communicate to you what I've read. And human nature is you communicate those things that you find concerning. I don't think my colleagues were interested in me writing a memo about all the things I think the FBI and DOJ did correctly. I think there's a presumption that they're going to do things correctly. I think they were interested in things that caught my attention as being atypical. So there are a ton of things that were atypical. I mean, relying on political opposition research in a court pleading is unusual. I've never seen it done before. And if you're going to rely on it, if you and I are political opponents and you're going to take opposition research on me to a judge or to a law enforcement agency, I think there's an expectation that law enforcement agency is going to vet or investigate the reliability of that information. So we know that political opposition research was used. We know that it was not vetted. We know that the source, Christopher Steele, really wasn't a source. He was just repeating what others in another country had told him. And we also know the FBI wound up dismissing him as a source for breaching two separate FBI rules. If you're the finder of fact, if you're the judge, do you want to know that? Do you want to know where the information came from? If I have information on you, I think it's fair to know whether it came from your best friend or your mortal enemy. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it does instruct and inform me, maybe I need to go investigate. Equally hard if it's his best friend or his mortal enemy, there's something called bias. I need to go investigate to see how accurate it is. So I did feel an obligation to notify my colleagues on the committee of what I found. My colleagues were alarmed, and many of them are old hands at intelligence, and they're not easily alarmed. And then we voted to make it available to the entire conference. Now, keep in mind, Bob, every single Democrat voted no on releasing our memo. Every single Republican voted yes on releasing the Democrat memo. Every one. They're a week behind us. There's a cost to being a week behind, and there's a benefit to being a week behind. And Adam Schiff is no dummy. He's a better politician than he is a lawyer, but he's pretty good at both. He knew going a week behind allowed him to respond to our memo. I mean, whoever goes second has a tremendous advantage. You know what the other side's talking about. So he wanted to go second, but have them both released at the same time. Adam, you should have done it when we did it. You're a week behind us. And oh, by the way, you also, in my judgment, intentionally included things that you knew you could not include, which creates this aura that something is being withheld. I read every word of the Dem memo twice. There's a way to phrase it and get all the information they want out without revealing sources and methods. There's a way to do it, and I'm sure their second iteration will do it that way. But the first one was designed for you and others to ask me, why are you treating their memo differently? And they were successful. That's what's happened. You have a Russia investigation completely without a dossier. There was a meeting at Trump Tower that has nothing to do with the dossier. There was a George Papadopoulos meeting that has nothing to do with the dossier. So Bob Mueller has at least 3 different functions I can think of, even if there was no dossier. So to the extent Republicans think it undercuts Bob Mueller, I don't agree. To the extent Republicans believe that there is no Russia investigation, Russia interfered with our election and attempted to influence our election with or without a dossier. And we need to find out how and why and make sure it doesn't happen again. None of that has anything to do with the dossier. So the Nunes memo to me is, from someone who is biased towards the FBI and the Department of Justice, it is my way of saying I have higher expectations of you as the world's premier law enforcement agency than to rely upon political opposition research that you did not vet. That doesn't even get into the bias in the Strucken page text. I've worked around cops for over 2 decades. I've never, ever seen that level of not just bias, animus towards the target of an investigation. It's unprecedented in any case that I have seen. So the Bureau and DOJ do have legitimate questions they should answer. I'm confident they can, but not if they're not asked. And if it were up to Adam Schiff and the Democrats on the Intel Committee, you and I would not have been able to have that last exchange because they didn't want any of that information coming out.
Something else I'd like to talk about. Sadly, this week there was another school shooting. 17 kids dead. What do we do? How do we stop that?
I wish I knew, Bob.
Is common sense gun control a part of a solution? And I understand that people think it's an attack on the Second Amendment, but isn't there some middle ground? I mean, nobody wants to take away guns. I do have an interest in not seeing more dead children.
You know, I like to start with the law. There are restrictions on every right you have. There, you know, as a journalist, there are even restrictions on your First Amendment right. There are things that you cannot commit actual malice. There are restrictions on the Second Amendment. There are restrictions on every right that we have. So there is no argument that there can and are and should be restrictions. That right is not absolute. It is important, I think, for your viewers to understand why there is a Second Amendment and which of the arguments in support of it make the most sense. The one that makes the most sense to me is the self-defense argument. You'll hear from time to time we have to be able to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government. If government has nuclear weapons, you're not going to be able to protect yourself. That argument does not sway me. The self-defense argument, particularly because of the victims I've seen throughout the course of my life, it does sway me. So when I think about gun control, first thing I think of is all the controls we currently have. My mind immediately goes to what laws could have been enforced to prevent this shooting or any other shooting. And if the answer is none, if the answer is there is no law on the books that if enforced would have prevented that, then I think the conversation shifts to, okay, what additional laws do we need? Is it magazine capacity? But keep in mind what we're arguing with magazine capacity. Keep in mind, if you argue, I think the capacity should be 12. 12 dead children is not acceptable to anyone. So, of course, the lower the fatality rate, the better, of course. But if the objective is to eliminate the fatalities altogether, then there's an access to weaponry, there's the nature of the weaponry, there's the magazine capacity, there's a mental illness component to it. As you know, it's already against the law for someone who's been adjudicated mentally ill to possess even a bullet, a single bullet. I am disappointed at how gun prosecutions went down for 8 years. I find that inexplicable, how gun prosecutions could go down at the federal level. If there are insufficient gun laws and there is a nexus between if we had this law, we would not have these mass killings. I'll tell you what I said 2 days ago. Sign me up. Sign me up. The gun show loophole, we hear a lot about that. And I ask my Democrat colleagues all the time, how many mass killings have been conducted with firearms purchased at gun shows? If the answer is none, then I'm afraid what you're doing, close the gun show loophole. It's not nearly as big as the public thinks anyway. Go ahead and close it. If you're not impacting mass killings, then what have you done? You have done something that addresses a problem that currently does not exist. I want to address the problem of people who, and it may be a cultural, I was talking to my daughter yesterday, other countries don't have these kinds of shootings. I don't know what it is about our culture that in our kids' lifetime, we have had this proliferation of mass killing. But if you or anyone else can come up with a constitutionally sound way of preventing it, you can sign me up.
After Las Vegas, there was an uproar about bump stocks. That would certainly, I think, reduce the number of fatalities.
It can be done administratively in a day.
And it can, but again, there was the uproar, there was the talk about action, and there's been no action. So what is it going to take to spur action?
I don't know, the bump stock was easy to me. Fully automatic weapons are per se illegal, and if any device turns a semi-automatic into a fully automatic, that is tantamount to sanctioning a fully automatic weapon, which are already against the law, against federal law. I don't care about states. It's against federal law to have a fully automatic machine gun. I don't know. For 2 or 3 days, there will be discussion about it, and then there will be a movement on to something else. Each member, I guess, would have to tell you what drives it from his or her consciousness. For those of us, Boehner asked me to meet with the parents from Sandy Hook with him. Nothing drives that conversation from my consciousness. Nothing will, in my whole 7 years, will compare to having parents pass pictures of their children across the table to me. So I used to prosecute those cases. I know what gun violence does. You bring me something that is constitutionally sound, defensible, that addresses mass killings by whatever definition you want to use, I'm happy to advocate for it. But when the best I hear is a gun show loophole that's not going to stop a single mass killing, then that leads me to believe that the issue is, they want the issue as opposed to the remedy.
You've got roughly 11 months left. What do you want to do in those 11 months?
I'm still in the throes of a couple of investigations.
Which of them?
The Russia probe, what Russia did to interfere with the 2016 election, with whom, if anyone, did they do it, the U.S. government's response, and then the issue of the dissemination of classified information. Chairman Goodlatte, our judiciary, and I are looking at the decisions made in 2016 by the Department of Justice. You know, keep in mind there was a time Democrats were not, they also were not happy with decisions made in 2016. The press conference, a lot of Democrats thought was unusual, and it was. The letters to Congress in the fall of 2016, a lot of Democrats thought not only were unusual, but impacted the election. We're doing these interviews privately, which is my preference for doing interviews. They're not public, so the public may not be aware that we're doing it, but it is the most conducive way of getting information, private transcribed interviews. We are investigating the interim security clearance as of a couple of days ago. The Oversight Committee, USA Gymnastics team, that's a number of our investigations are bipartisan and apolitical. They don't make a ton of news, but those are the ones I actually enjoy the most when all hands are on deck, pulling in the same direction. There'll be an immigration debate at some point soon. We have appropriations coming up in the late spring, early summer. Election years are unusual in that most folks go home at a certain point to campaign for re-election. So the calendar is very different in an election year than it is in an off year. I'm not a big traveler. The House Intel Committee expects you to travel some. I'm going to go to the Middle East with some Senate colleagues. Some interesting things even in the last week that have happened there. Other than that, try to do the constituent service that is expected and deserved in this district, and finish out, be there on the last day of the last vote.
You mentioned immigration. Where are you on DACA, and where are you on the law?
On DACA, I'm not aware of any category in which children are viewed through the same legal prism as adults. I don't know if you've ever been in a grocery store and seen a kid take a grape. We generally don't prosecute them for that. If you've ever been in a restaurant and you hear a kid screaming his head off, we don't prosecute them for violating the noise ordinance. You don't prosecute kids who are in the car while their parents speeding or driving under the influence. In fact, you view them as a victim. So I think the law in every category treats children, particularly before the age of legal accountability, differently from the way you treat the parents. If I were emperor, you should move, but if you didn't move, I would have a pretty robust background check. I don't want people with domestic violence convictions on a path to anything other than deportation. I don't want people with violent crime criminal histories. I don't want them. If you If you have made decisions that would lead reasonable people to conclude that you would not be a good fellow citizen, then I don't want you on a path to anything. If you can pass that background check, I was having breakfast with a really conservative Senate friend of mine yesterday who pointed out our country does not have a great history of having people with presence but not citizenship. Going all the way back to the times of slavery. Presence without citizenship usually doesn't work for either side. So I'm open to citizenship for DACA children that can pass a rigorous background check. And I think Democrats would privately tell you that's success, but we're in a political world. And as soon as Republicans suggest something that might be acceptable, the target moves, the goal moves. And again, I hate to use this phrase, would you rather have the issue or rather have the resolution? If it's about winning, sometimes you'd rather have the issue. From 2008 to 2010, my friends on the other side of the aisle had every gear of government, the House, the Senate, and the White House. You didn't see immigration reform and you didn't see gun control. Maybe they had higher priorities, I don't know, but they had 2 years and we didn't see either one of them. So I would like to see DACA fixed. I don't think border security should be a negotiating chip in immigration reform. I think border security and interior security, because well over half the people that are currently here unlawfully didn't cross any border. They were invited and overstayed. So you can build the tallest wall you want. That's not going to take care of that. Border and interior security, so you can have some confidence that this is the last time we're going to have this conversation as a nation. I think my fellow citizens are remarkably generous, particularly with people that have played by the rules and manifest a desire to be a constructive fellow citizen. I think they're incredibly generous. And I think that is relatively easy to accomplish if we were not in a political environment where we were always trying to one-up the other side for the next election.
Last question. Before you ran the first time, we talked. You talked about the reasons you wanted to run. One of those being you expressed a concern for the direction of the country. 8 years later, how do you feel about the direction of the country?
Yeah, that's a good and a weird question. I think politically we're not in a great place. I think the overwhelming majority of my fellow citizens have a desire to live and coexist peacefully with one another, even in a world of contrast. We're in the upstate of South Carolina. You are essentially born a Clemson or a Carolina fan, and you cannot overstate how significant those are. It's more important than religion and politics to some people. Yet we coexist peacefully 364 days out of the year. The contrast is fine. It's the conflict that is debilitating, I had to pause 2 weeks ago to think about whether or not I should mention the names of the Democrats. The first 2 texts I got when I announced I was leaving were from Democrats, progressive Democrats. I had to stop and think, should I use their names because it would hurt them, for their constituents to know that they were friends with a crazy guy from South Carolina. That's a terrible place for us to be. And I'm not trying to advertise our book, but Senator Scott and I are equally concerned about it. We have written a book. It's not a political book at all. The only people made fun of in our book are Tim Scott and Trey Gowdy. But it is a book about overcoming differences. And I do think that 80% of us have about 80% of life in common. Before our interview started, you and I were talking about our daughters. That is enough for you and I to spend the rest of the day talking. We have the exact same hopes and dreams and aspirations for our children. We're both golfers, although you get to play a lot more than I do. So we have a choice. We can identify those things we have in common, or we can run to the things we don't, and then demigod and demonize one another. And I've seen the enemy. I've been in a courtroom. I've seen what evil looks like. people who disagree with me on political issues are not the enemy. As somebody that maybe my persuasive skills need to be better, or maybe we just agree to disagree on how we're going to get someplace. I am worried about the modern political environment. I remain cautiously optimistic that my fellow citizens are really good at figuring out how to get along with one another, even in spite of political or ideological differences.
Thank you, Congressman, for your
Yes,
time
sir.
today.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Yes, sir.
Always.
Thank you. Appreciate it.